So I'm also getting comments on that country music video like this from people who think New Orleans was never considered a melting pot. And they keep implying the caucasity. Never mind the fact that I already pointed out that the muffaletta was invented by Sicilian immigrants during the Great Depression, or that Mardi Gras itself was brought over by French explorers. But let's not forget the fact that the foundation of New Orleans culture is rooted in the indigenous people who were here long before any white men came to the New World. Even people who have simply visited New Orleans probably knows this mouthful, which by the way is pronounced Tchoupitoulas Street. Tchoupitoulas being the now extinct tribe that now inhabit the region of New Orleans. In fact, some of the oldest streets in New Orleans were originally dirt trails carved out by the indigenous Tchoupitoulas people. In fact, the reason the Creole French dialect has changed so much from the native French tone is because it combined with the Tchoupitoulas language. In fact, many places in Louisiana still keep their indigenous name. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the first European settlement in Louisiana was not New Orleans, but Natchitoches, which is an indigenous name. Then there's Ouachita Parish, also an indigenous name. The Atchafalaya Basin, also indigenous. And along the Atchafalaya Basin, you have the city of Opelousas, which is also an indigenous name. And even though the Tchoupitoulas tribe is functionally extinct, their descendants still live in much of the New Orleans area because they reproduced with white settlers as well as African slaves. In fact, while the name gumbo is derived from a West African okra stew, the practice of stewing whatever meats and veggies you had on hand goes back to the Tchoupitoulas tribe. Then as Africans were brought here as slaves, they brought in okra and their own cooking styles. And eventually, after the 7 Years' War, Cajun French exiles started settling in Louisiana, adding their own spin on the dish. Primarily normalizing adding chicken and sausage to gumbo while also adding the Holy Trinity, bell pepper, onions, and celery, which they brought over from France. And in fact, it is this mixing of cultures that not only created gumbo, but where the notion of a melting pot came from. And this is why many Creoles who are indeed primarily of African descent don't always look dark-skinned, such as Deacon John Moore, New Orleans jazz icon. Fun fact, he's actually my old roommate's mom's boyfriend, by the way. Great guy, I actually had the privilege of meeting him several times. But that leads me into another point about his early music career. This gentleman started his music career in the city of New Orleans during the height of Jim Crow. And because most of his family was dark-skinned and visibly black, and they knew he was of African descent, they didn't want him playing at their club. Well, at the same time, many of the black clubs wouldn't let him play there because he wasn't dark enough. In fact, I actually have another roommate whose grandfather was also the first OBGYN in Louisiana, and he also faced similar prejudices when he was in medical school. Basically, he wasn't black, he was Lebanese, and he was still forced to sit at the back of the bus because he was dark-skinned, but the black people also knew he wasn't of African descent, so they held their own prejudices against him. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that black people didn't contribute anything at all to New Orleans culture. Quite the opposite. It goes without saying, New Orleans music would not exist without black people. Much of New Orleans cooking would not exist without black people. Black people definitely deserve credit for a large percentage of New Orleans culture. That goes without saying. But to say all of New Orleans culture is because of black people erases the indigenous heritage that the city was foundationally built on. When you say that everything great about New Orleans comes from black people, the first group of people you're disrespecting isn't the white people who came from across the ocean, it's the indigenous Tchoupitoulas people. And while it is important to educate yourself about the historical racism not only in New Orleans but all of Louisiana, the fact of the matter is there is just as much colorism within the black community itself. It's perfectly justifiable and valid to criticize the involvement of slavery or the fact that New Orleans was at one point the largest slave port in the continental U.S. It's perfectly valid to call out white people for the genocides they carried out against indigenous people. It is perfectly valid to point out that the Tchoupitoulas people should still be around to this day, but they were essentially bred out of extinction. But that doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of stuff people like about New Orleans also comes from those same white people. It doesn't matter what Afrocentrists want you to believe. New Orleans is and has always been a melting pot of varying different cultures. And to say otherwise is utter disrespect to the indigenous people who laid the foundations on what New Orleans culture was built on. Like seriously, it's bad enough that the tribe itself doesn't exist anymore. To say that everything great about New Orleans is because of black people is erasing the legacy of a tribe that no longer exists.